I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. But thank you for being here. I'm so grateful to have the conversation. I'm so looking forward to it. I think your work is just staggeringly helpful and so needed. And so I'm just really looking forward to having the conversation. So here's my little introduction. Dr. Pasi Sahlberg is one of the world's leading experts on educational policy, a leader in the global discussion on educational reform. Dr. Sahlberg worked in the Finnish Ministry of Education, and he was one of the designers of Finland's world-renowned educational model. He's advised organizations like the OECD and the World Bank on educational policies, held academic positions at Harvard University, University of Helsinki, and the University of New South Wales. It's one of the most important voices. I really believe this to be the truth. Most important voices speaking out for teacher professionalism. And I'm really grateful and honored to have you here. The most important book, I suppose, the one that most people know is this one, Finnish Lessons. I've got 3.0. And there's a 2.0, 1.0. You should probably read all three, I would think would be the way to go. And it's a great book. It offers a vision for what education could be that's inspiring and encouraging. And he also co-authored books such as In Teachers We Trust and Let the Children Play, advocating for teacher autonomy and student well-being. So that's my little intro. I don't usually do an intro, but I didn't want to mess it up. So I wanted to make sure I got it right. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's good to be with you.
And, whenever I can talk to somebody with a hockey sweater on, I'm all, or a hockey t-shirt on, I'm all in. Even if it is the Boston Bruins, my all-time least favorite team. So it's all good. So maybe we could just start. Could you tell us a bit about your history and experiences with schools in Finland? This would be something people would have a deep knowledge of if they read Finnish Lessons, but just give us kind of a quick background.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jim, for the introduction and for being with you. Yeah, I'm one of those people with the kind of a lifelong experience in education. It goes actually as far as that I was born in a primary school. Both of my parents were teachers. My father was a head teacher in a small rural school in Finland. So my story really starts there, and probably it's no wonder that teaching was the kind of a first choice for me after high school, and I went to study mathematics and became a mathematics and science teacher. I was doing that for a while, and then preparing teachers to teach those subjects in Finland. And then the international, the world really took me on, and I went to work with the OECD and the World Bank and many other organizations, and did big part of my work overseas, including the United States. So I lived 5 years in Washington, D.C., but I'm fine now. And work in different universities around the world. And now I'm being here in Australia for these 6 years. I came here just before the pandemic,
Right.
And decided to stay here with my family. I'm teaching education policy and leadership at the University of Melbourne here, and I work a lot with the schools here. So my work is not the kind of a traditional academic work, writing papers and books and just doing research. I do research, but a big part of my time is working with and in schools. So I try to understand this eternal question: how do we make schools and school systems better? And so my journey continues at the moment here. I still keep close contacts to Finland. I go there and collaborate with my colleagues, but here I'm right now down under, as I talk to you from Melbourne.
Well, I think I'm actually part Australian. I start every day with Vegemite. I even made a little Vegemite commercial to publicize our institute in Melbourne last year. So
Yeah, and I see you often here, Jim, in the different conferences.
Yeah, well, we have our institute this September. I'll be in Melbourne. So if you're there, I'd love to have dinner with you. It'd be wonderful.
Sure.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
and it is one of the great cities of the world. I mean, Melbourne's just an absolutely humane scale to the city. For the size of it, it's quite wonderful. So I wanted to start off just sort of with a little bit of the story about the schools in Finland, because they weren't always a global leader in education, and it evolved over time. So maybe you could give us a kind of overview, and then we'll go deeper into some of the things.
Yeah, I think really, if anybody wants to really understand the Finland's education story, it requires a little bit understanding of the history and what the country is like, because we are quite different from many others, a small Nordic nation between great empire of Russia historically, and then the West, Sweden, and the rest of the Scandinavia. But I think that what really kicked off the kind of early thinking of the what type of education Finland or school system we should have was the fact that after the Second World War, when there was a baby boom, there was a need for much more education, not just a different type of education, but we needed new schools and make sure that all these new children have an education. But then at the same time, soon after the 50s and 60s, we started to experience a really massive transformation of the economy that shifted away from agrarian economy to more industrial and then the post-industrial economy that really called for a very different type of human capital from the country. So we were kind of faced on the challenge of what type of system would give us the educated people, and that we would be able to compete with the Sweden and the rest of the Western world in economy. And the key question that time was really that really determined the future of Finland is that do we need an education system that is good for some people, that we kind of educate the elite like many other systems that time had, or should we have a system that would provide education equally for every child? And we decided as a Nordic nation, it's a common thing there to kind of think about the cohesion and equality and fairness. So we decided to start to build the education system that it provides good, high quality education for all. And it was a kind of a different thing to think about those things that it is now. I'm talking about time 50 years ago. And I think that the smart thing that the Finns did, again, being part of the Nordic Scandinavian culture, is that we define education as a right for every child rather than an education as a duty. And soon people realize that, if we're going to have a good education system that is good for everyone, we need teachers that are high professionals, that you cannot get that done without having great teachers in each and every school. So that was one thing. Then the other one, again, this goes back to understanding Finland as a country, that the only people that speak Finnish are the Finns. So as soon as you step outside of the country borders to Sweden or Germany or US, nobody understands Finnish. So we need to learn languages. And this is, again, a different thing that many people don't kind of understand, that what does it mean if you insist that every single child has to speak two domestic languages, Finnish and Swedish, and then two foreign languages, often English and French or Spanish or something else. So this became with this reform movement that everybody has to be educated in a kind of highest possible level in these things. Then we also, unlike most others, we emphasized music and arts from the beginning, understanding that they play a critically important role in educating good people. And we soon realized that there actually is a pretty cool combination also when the innovation demand became in the 1980s and 90s, that the kids who have had access to good music and arts education were more likely to think differently and creatively than others. So that was the kind of idea that we decided to design and redesign the entire system to enable everyone to learn from early years to the university and beyond. That this idea of lifelong learning that is often a buzzword without any meaning in many other systems. I think the Finns really took that seriously, and that's how we have continued to develop and build a system so that it's for everyone and throughout the life.
You quoted Dr. Vilho Hirvi. He was then the Director General of Finland's National Board of Education, and he said this, I want to get the quotation right: "An educated nation cannot be created by force." Tell me more about what that means.
Yeah, the Vilho, he was actually my first boss at the Finnish Ministry of Education, or we call it the National Board of Education. And so he was leading this transition from the old Finnish system to the new one in the early 1990s. And we need to remember that in the 1990s, the Finnish education system that was kind of coming out of this old traditional old kind of arrangement was based on a central control and command type of management. And so what Hirvi meant by that sentence, that when he was speaking to the staff, he said, we can't continue like that. We can't build a system that is good for everyone if it's based on the kind of a central control and what somebody giving orders or directions what to do. So because Hirvi was the academic himself and qualified teacher, so he really understood that the teacher professionalism is a kind of a key driver in the way ahead. And his key theory of change really was that we need to build trust in teachers so that we allow schools collectively to find the best ways to design a curriculum and how to teach children, and also how to evaluate outcomes. That was a revolutionary that time. And he also said that when you trust teachers, you don't need to use force on them. You don't need to dictate what they do. So I think that these days, when I look back of the, those things that when he was leading the system, that his message was also kind of a criticism of then prominent neoliberal idea that externally imposed standards and punitive accountability and compliance to all expectations and external demands are the best ways to improve education outcomes. And it remains a kind of a historical and significant notion, because only now we really realize that how important that sentence and idea that we kind of force goodness, that we can't really mandate what matters in the schools. And there are many others like Michael Fullan in Canada who was writing about those things in the 1990s, that you can't mandate what matters, influence the way the Finns thought about this. And it's a good example of how the foreign influence in Finland has played a critical role, not in the sense that we had adopted models from overseas, but we have listened to some of the authorities like Howard Gardner and Michael Fullan and others very carefully, and people like Vilho Hirvi have translated those things so that they mean something for the Finnish education context.
Yeah, Michael was actually my mentor at University of Toronto, so I took courses with him, and I had to tape record the conversations because I couldn't keep up with his brain, and then I'd come back at little cassette tapes. I'd go back and listen to the tape and make sense of what he said. But he's, I was just trying to figure out what I was going to do as a graduate student. He was extremely generous with his time. He had a profound. He introduced me to people like Peter Senge and Margaret Weasley, and Peter Block. Peter Block was really influential. And
Michael still remains a very kind of a generous. I just had a talk with him on Monday or Tuesday actually here, and he's so willing to share these things. And Michael has this kind of a perspective on these things. He's been here for a long time.
Yeah, he's brilliant. Okay, well, and I'll say, in my writing, just sort of parallel to this is my way of putting it is that change happens from the inside out, not from the outside in. You can't.
That's right.
Really, no change happens unless the person chooses to do it. Now, they might choose to do it out of fear or out of compliance, but if they're doing it out of fear and compliance, it's not a deep level of commitment. If you really want a deep level of commitment, you have to start inside. And most people who teach, they want to make a difference. So real change happens when you make your mind up. You want to see a difference for kids. So if professional learning starts from the inside out instead of the outside in, you've got a much better chance. And that means you probably start with kids and not with strategies. You say, what do I want to see my kids do that they're not doing, and build it backwards. Yeah. Kind of how we design our work. Heavily influenced by Michael.
Yeah.
You write about the importance of teacher professionalism, and so I'd love to hear you say more about what's that mean to treat teachers as professionals, to celebrate, respect, acknowledge their professionalism. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jim, because often people understand this teacher professionalism only by looking at their level of academic preparation and say, okay, we give teachers a master's degree and they're professionals. But I think the Finnish way of seeing this is a little bit different because we really try to see that what other high professionals do, for example, doctors, lawyers, or architects, or designers. And there are a number of things that they have in common, but obviously things vary a little bit which professionals you're talking about. But typically all these high professionals, that we include teachers in Finland and some other countries as well, have to do things like they actively follow developments in their own professions. they have their journals and conferences and communities and associations that they kind of actively are part in this. So this is one thing. Then the other one is that they use, all the professionals use the science of some sort and systematic knowledge, including collective practice, to inform their decision making in action. And thirdly, the professionals, they are committed to continuous improvement and professional learning throughout their careers. And if you define profession like this, then what it means for teachers as professionals gets a different type of meaning. And I think with this professionalism understanding comes the fact that we need to trust teachers and their ability to make key decisions regarding their work, just like we usually trust our medical GPs or medical experts as well. In other words, the teachers they need to have enough control over the curriculum, not all the control, but enough control so that they feel that they're in charge. They need to obviously have a freedom to decide how to teach children, rather than somebody mandating those teaching methods from outside. And thirdly, and this is again the Finnish understanding, is that the teachers as professionals, they have to have active role in judging and assessing the outcomes of their work. And this is probably the most critical part of this whole thing, because almost in the entire rest of the world, the student assessment is completely taken away from teachers' work, so that teachers can decide the curriculum and how to teach, but then there's somebody else who will tell them how did they kind of succeed with this. In Finland, we have deliberately tried to keep this assessment responsibility as one of the three key elements of the teacher professionalism. And I think that through this type of narrative, when we look at some of the responsibilities and natures of professionalism, we can go beyond just saying that teachers need academic training or master's degree.
The way I see this, and I'll just use this to lead into my next question, but is that part of professionalism is discretion, the capacity to use your professional discretion. So if I go see a doctor, if he's acting like a professional or she's acting like a professional, she doesn't treat me like the next person. She looks at me as an individual, and she uses all the knowledge and expertise she has to make an individual decision in the moment. She's not just treating me like, she doesn't use a script to talk to me. And it seems to me, as I look at your concepts of professionalism and teachers, that autonomy is a big part of what you see. That idea of profession, because to me, discretion is also a continuous improvement is an always present characteristic, but the capacity to make decisions for yourself is an always present character. That's what professionals do. If you don't give teachers that autonomy, from my perspective, you're treating them like they're unskilled laborers, stocking shelves in Walmart. A professional has autonomy and makes decisions. But
yeah,
how do you see it? You talked a lot about autonomy.
That's why, Jim, we see so many teachers leaving the profession now here in Australia and everywhere, because they feel that they don't have this autonomy to decide not only what to teach, but what is actually happening in the classroom.
Yeah. So, but it is central. Would you say autonomy is a central part of the work you do?
I think it is.
You describe what teachers do. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think autonomy is a really important. But I think that there needs to be a kind of the caveat here that sometimes people understand teacher autonomy as if teachers can do whatever they want. Right. And when people read my texts or what teachers do in some other countries, they go and say, but these teachers are not doing whatever they want. So that's why I think it's I often use these days, I use the term teachers collective autonomy. That is, again, comes from the work of Michael and Andy Hargreaves as well. When they wrote their book, Professional Capital, they introduced this idea of collective autonomy in the teaching profession. That means that teachers have more autonomy from the authorities in the top, but less autonomy or freedom, if you wish, from one another. And that's why I do believe that this type of collective professional autonomy in teachers' work is a central element of professionalism, and also the kind of a sense of being a professional. But it comes through the kind of a collective, collaborative nature of autonomy. That is a little bit different thing.
Right. So I have this quote, Alvar Aalto, Finland's most renowned architect and designer. This is a quote from your book. He made the wise statement that we should work for simple, good, undecorated things, but things that are in harmony with the human being and organically suited to the little man in the street. Similarly, one might say that Finnish teachers prefer traditional, reliable, calm teaching over the sort of heroic feats we've seen in the movies. If anyone thinks they're going to find a bunch of Robin Williamses from Dead Poets Society in Finnish schools, they'll be disappointed. Finns don't believe a few super teachers can save their children in their schools. It takes a whole village to to raise a child. So tell me about that wonderful quote. It's also why your hockey teams are so good, but that's a different story.
That's a different story. That's actually a nice thing. I didn't remember that. I actually wrote that. But, probably the motivation to write something like this was that when Finland became a global rock star and in education, many people thought that the Finns had created something monumental and glorious and having, the heroic teachers using magical teaching methods in their classrooms. But then, over time, very quickly, most of the thousands or tens of thousands of visitors to Finnish schools were surprised and some even disappointed not to find any of that in the Finnish schools. Instead, what they saw was a kind of a calm classrooms, modest teachers who didn't, teach or talk that much. They found students who spent actually much less time in a school and kind of a formal study and have much fewer homework than the most others. And only that the kind of came a kind of a understanding that, there's something in design of the Finnish education that is, makes things work. Just like Alvar Aalto that I refer to this, that citation was he's our most famous architect, and he was a designer of grand buildings. Like if you come to Helsinki, you will see some of those things. But they all have this kind of a minimalist touch. They're very simple, straight, kind of a basic things. That every part of the building that he designed has a purpose and function. So for me, I think the Finnish education system is designed on the same similar principles. I'm a cyclist myself. I do a lot of road cycling, and in a way, when I look at my Tour de France road race bike down there in the garage, I see the Finnish kind of a Finnish education system there, because every single piece of the bike or the system has a purpose, and that's exactly the main principle how the Alvar Aalto designed the buildings and how we have designed the education system, that we have removed deliberately everything that doesn't serve any purpose, and the purpose here obviously is the student learning and their well-being and kind of belonging to the school. So we have this kind of a plain, beautiful Nordic design that you can find in the Finnish education system. I definitely, when I compare the Finnish education system to education systems here in Australia, that are much more inspired by the kind of a Victorian style of design. That there's all these beautiful, fancy things, and you can't actually see the shape and form and function of the system behind these things. But the Finnish way of thinking is the same, and the ice hockey is a good example as well. That doing small things but doing them well is something that gives you what you want.
It all comes back to hockey. One of the things they wouldn't have seen when people came to the Finland schools is standardized tests. So you're not really a big fan of the tests. So tell me, if you don't mind, tell me about that.
Yeah, actually, Jim, to be completely honest, I'm not a fan of how standardized tests are used in practice to rank students and schools or endorse the kind of narrow purpose of education, or boost the competition between schools and now increasingly between school systems. But I do believe that, like many others, that when these standardized tests are well designed, when they're good tests and they're used for the purposes that they have been designed to serve, then the standardized assessments are absolutely necessary tools in improving quality and equity in education. Some people often say that I'm a kind of anti-standardized testing, but they don't say that I'm anti-standardized testing of the bad tests, low quality tests that are used for wrong purposes. But my main concern for many years in these debates that we have had, and you have had a lot in North America, has been about the kind of over reliance on these what we call census-based standardized assessment, meaning that we're testing all the kids with a high-stake assessments all the time, rather than choosing sample-based tests instead. And oftentimes, most of the times, actually, the sample-based standardized assessments could do exactly what these census-based tests do: cheaper, no consequences or harm for kids. So I think, I've been offering this. That I think I learned this from John Merrill, a good friend from the Education Reporter in New York. So he said something like this: a standardized test often typically ask questions like, "How good is Johnny in mathematics?" And better question that these assessments should ask is that, how is Johnny good in math? Just by changing a little bit the order of the word, we get a completely different thing. And I think that the Finnish way, for example, has been much more focusing on this, how children are good in what they do, rather than how good they are compared to others in school.
Well, plus the standardized tests maybe overemphasize achievement. Obviously, you want to have achievement, but we want well-being. We want kids who love learning. We want kids who are curious and who are able to problem solve, who have good learning strategies, good learners, and they're not really assessing that. They're just assessing. And when you got a spotlight on one thing, that's where all the focus goes, and we leave out some of the more important things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got another quote. So you write, people sometimes incorrectly assume that equity means the same as equality. Now we're going to have a conversation about this. People sometimes incorrectly assume that equity means the same as equality in education. In other words, all students should be treated the same way in school, taught the same curriculum, given the same amount of instruction, or they should achieve the same learning outcomes in school. Could you tell me more about that? And the reason I said we're going to talk about it is because one of my principles is equality, but I think I have a different definition than the definition here. So, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, this is really based on my professional work and research over the last 20, 30 years, really. And our research and my work, particularly my advocacy work to the politicians and practitioners around the world about this, has shown me that still today is quite common to think that equity in education means that we provide all students opportunity or access to good education. I've seen it here firsthand in Australia just recently, when the Australian governments are trying to bring more equity, what they call equity or fairness, kind of a fair education into the picture. And it's often the kind of a confusion between these two things. The equality of educational opportunity is absolutely necessary and important condition for equitable education, but it's not enough. And this is where people need to kind of stop and think a little bit more. Because for me, and this my view, is that the real equity in education requires that educational outcomes are not a kind of a main result of students' family background, their parents, or where they live, or the race or language they speak at home. For me, the kind of a key aspect or critical aspect of equity is equity of educational outcomes, not just access to education or what the inputs, what the system or school is doing for the kids. So that's why I think we need to focus more on these outcomes. What are the outcomes of education? And again, Jim, just like you made a note earlier, that these outcomes need to be defined broader than just the literacy and mathematics, as it's often done. The well-being is a very important thing now, and then we have all these competencies that kids need more and more in their future lives than they have never done before. We never paid attention actually to, how equitable are the outcomes if they are about creativity or innovation or communication or problem solving. Those things we have no idea how unequal the education systems are in this place. So that's why I think this for kind of a more focusing on these outcomes and equality or equity of outcomes is such an important thing for the future.
Yeah, I think I agree with you 100%. And what I would say is, when I talk about equality, I'm talking not about how people are treated or uh, everybody getting the same thing. I'm saying that every human being has the same value, and that equality is also, I don't see you as an object. I see you as a person, an individual. And so, to me, equality is the idea that every human being has equal value, is an a priori notion of equity. And because every person has equal value, we need to treat them differently. We need to do
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
because people don't have equal access. They don't come from the same place. They need different supports. So that's how I see it. But I think quality's got kind of a bad name because it means we treat everybody the same. And what I'm saying is it's saying that every human, and some people might need a lot more, and we need to be more concerned about some people, but we do that because we think they're just as important as us. That's how I see it.
Yeah, and Jim, I think it's very important these days that we don't, when we continue to have conversations and debates about the equality and equity, that we don't end up in a kind of an either or war
No.
as we have it. That it's we need, as I said, we need both. We need to have equality of opportunity in education, but we need to go beyond and also see, what happens after that.
Right.
And that's why this equity, understanding equity in a deeper way is so important.
Yeah, I would say equity is the fruit of equality. I mean, equality in the sense that I recognize the value of that person. Once I recognize that I'm not more important than them, they're not one down, I'm one up.
Exactly.
Then,
Yeah.
then we have to address that in a whole different way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
I love this acronym, GERM. You criticize the global education reform movement. How nice that all laid out for you. What you refer to as GERM. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, this germ
What's this germ virus that's infecting everything?
actually the metaphor is directly from the medical
Right.
or epidemiology thing. But this started, and I have to acknowledge here the work that Andy Hargreaves had done in the late 1990s. He did a lot of studies in Canada about and understanding the Ontario system, and he was using the term global education reform agenda. So he kind of argued that some of the education systems are following the kind of a global movements. They're not like official policies or programs, but just kind of a agendas or ideas that travel from one country to another. And I spent a lot of time working with Andy that time, and me, I'm not a native English speaker, so I the words mean different things for me. So I kind of realized that if you change the agenda to just call it a movement, because I saw that it's more of a movement than agenda.
Mhm.
I didn't see that there's an agenda for that, but I saw that there's a movement that many countries were kind of following these fashionable systems, like the English way of transforming or reforming education in the 1990s, United States. The standards, all these assessments and accountability stuff, all this language came from there. So in the early 2000s, there was a kind of a high hopes that these countries that have followed this more like a market-based neoliberal idea of competition, standardization, testing, accountability, school choice, a kind of a running school systems, education systems like corporations, that they will, in these new OECD's PISA studies in the 2000s, the study in the year 2000, that the evidence will show that this is a kind of a superior way of quickly transform education systems so that the results are there. And what was a huge surprise in the early 2000s, the first studies here 2000, 2003 and 6, was that none of these countries that belong to this movement, this germ movement, were actually anywhere near there on the best performing education systems. Like Finland was one of them. Canada, the other one. Canada has been a little bit like influenced by this germ, but not in the sense that I would consider Canadian provinces as part of this thing. But this started to kind of bring these interesting questions that, so what the heck is happening in the world? Because those countries that were very much like in a center place of global education thinking in the 1990s with their ideas that I mentioned earlier, were not really able to show anything good. Actually, they were declining in the first 10 years in and so I came with in 2005 or 6. I wrote a first paper about this germ idea that maybe the thing is that the countries are just following the wrong lead or wrong ideas, and then it started to live its own life, and many other scholars or colleagues adapted this germ idea, and then it very quickly, this movement idea became also a political tool. Like, for example, in New Zealand, there was a whole national political campaign built around this germ thing, that New Zealand has been following the infected by this germ idea, and we need to bring kind of an antidote and help the country to recover by bringing alternative education policies there. So actually I had no control what happened with this germ idea probably about 15 years ago when people started to use the term and sometimes use it in a kind of a inappropriate ways, but in most times it was a kind of a helpful idea to use it as a metaphor for the health, where my argument has always been that we don't know if the country X decides to choose a direction in education and policy and reform a particular way. There's no way of saying that where did that idea come from? That there's usually no one person or no one program or document that is influenced. These education ministers and leaders, they travel around the world and they are infected somewhere. It's just like we have been infected, when the COVID was here. I didn't know where I got my COVID. So it was the same kind of a metaphor. And I think it's been healthy and helpful way of thinking about the health of an education system, in a sense that, if there's too much tough accountability or competition or standardization or testing, the education systems are not feeling well. They're not healthy. And we, just like in a health, that we need to think about what could help, what could kind of be a cure or antidote to that. And that's why, Finland became very quickly a kind of a global antidote to this germ, because the Finnish ideas, as we spoke earlier, were almost the opposite of what you had seen in England or the United States or New Zealand or here in Australia. And so people find a kind of an inspiration from, rather than just imitating the Finnish model, but trying to understand that how some of those elements might be helpful in their own systems to stop this decline in education in many ways and help the education system to recover. So that's a kind of a short story of I've been writing a lot about this germ even recently, and try to kind of make sense of how some of these metaphors or ideas can be helpful when people think about, particularly in times like this when nobody has any idea what to do next, that there are some lessons in the past that we have learned and we can probably use here.
Well, it's an adventure every day in the United States right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And education. You got some suggestions for what should happen in schools. You talk about students having frequent breaks so they can play, less homework, more variety in learning experiences. I guess a more human kind of experience in school. Why do you think those things are important? It's a bit of a leading question because it's pretty obvious.
I think, Jim, they are important. I think they're important for me in this time for a particular reason, and it is that, as you have seen as well, you travel around the world, you see that especially now in the post-COVID time, when countries, most education systems try to kind of recover, that they try to come back, and the student learning outcomes have declined everywhere, and the well-being and health and social emotional situation of the kids is all-time low. So when the systems try to respond to these things, at least here in Australia, and I know it's the same in the United States, that there has been this strong emphasis on what people call the evidence-based practice in schools. And often I try to make sense of what is this evidence-based thing means, because first of all, I had nothing against, I'm all in for the kind of doing evidence-based things. But then in practice, this term, evidence-based practice, almost always means that we use one method or one or two methods to teach that are so-called evidence-based things. And I think that's fine. There's a lot of evidence about different methods that work. But I have started to ask now that, what does the evidence say about all these other things? Like, how should we organize a school day? How should we schedule the school day in different, like, primary, younger kids, middle kids, or high school kids, so that it would truly based on evidence, what we know about how kids learn. And we do know that the attention span, this time that young children can focus on tasks so that we can expect that they learn something out of that, has shrunk. It's a very short, that time in a primary school, some people say that it's about 10 to 12 minutes. And after that, the time is waste. It's useless because the kids, their attention is all over the place and they need to do some other things. But what we see now here in Australia and many other places is that we do exactly the opposite, that we just extend this time and keep kids indoors longer and try to teach them kind of harder using these evidence-based methods. And so I think that these 3 things that you mentioned there, that kids have reasons and breaks to play and less emphasis on homework, and we think more about the learning experiences and environments are so important, because we need to, if we want to get all these indicators up that are now going downwards, including the well-being and learning, I think the evidence-based teaching is not going to do that. It's not going to give us more improvements so that we can say that this is good. We need to use this evidence also to see how kids really learn and what is important for their well-being. The studies, the research on play, for example, the benefits of play are very clear and approved and accepted around the world. And the research is very clear that kids need to move, they need to play, they need to go outdoors and recharge if we are expecting that they will do better in school. So that's why I think these 3 simple things that you mentioned, they're very important for me, and a central part of my work here in Australia and internationally when people are asking questions now that, so what should we do next? So what is the way forward? Again, I have nothing against the teachers doing their work based on evidence and informed by evidence. But, if the evidence-based means a particular approach and method, I have a lot to say about that.
I've got a couple of things that I'd like to add, if it's okay. So I guess that's a rhetorical question, because I'm just going to say it whether it's okay or not. But at any rate, I think traditionally professional development for teachers has started with research, or at least quasi-research practices that a consultant learns and teaches teachers how to do it, with the expectation that if they use evidence-based practices, there'll be good outcomes for kids. And that's how I used to start to do professional development 25 years ago. I had practices, research had been done. I worked at the Center for Research on Learning at the University of Kansas, and I do the training. And what I found was very few people implemented it effectively. They tried it for a while and it fizzled out, but it didn't happen. And so now the way we do it is we start with kids. We say, what do my students need? What are they not getting that's necessary? And then let's identify a goal you want. And then let's look at the research and see how to use it. And we would say, evidence is great. It's helpful. It gives you an indication. But what really matters is local validity. Does it work with these students in this classroom? And you have to be looking at what's happening with the kids, whether it's engagement or well-being or achievement. You have to be looking at that to say, because what works in one classroom is not necessarily going to work with this classroom. Take a simple thing like cold calling, which is very popular in the evidence base. Well, if your student is neurodiverse and they need a little extra time to process, or they don't want to be called out, they could burst up, but they could be a big problem in the classroom. Cold calling isn't going to work for every student. It might work for some, but you need to know who the students are and adapt what you do. So the evidence is important. Research is important. But what really matters is, what do my students need? And then how can we use the appropriate, not only that, and the other thing I'd say about this, I'm sorry, is that it's become ideological. It's not a thinking conversation. I'm either in this camp or I'm in that camp. And I think it shouldn't be this ideological argument about different approaches. It should be, what do my kids need and how am I able to respond to it? And that's why we emphasize coaching so much, because we think that's what you can accomplish. You can help the person access that research to do what they need to do with their kids. Instead of forcing it on the teacher, you start with the needs of the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one thing that I would like to add to your list of 3 things, if you don't mind, because
please.
I'm now thinking about this. That what else could be there? Because I think that these 3 things are important. I think I'm particularly seeing this here in Australia and in Nordic countries, that we are, for a long time we have been talking about student voice, that we need to listen to what students think when they're in school. And now the next thing, at least here, is that we see some education systems like South Australia here, for example, that is kind of a clearly giving the emphasis on what they call student agency. That is a little bit more than just listening to what you have to say. They help them to take the ownership and kind of a central role in their own learning and in the school. And I think that is something that I would really love to have, add to this list of 3 things that you mentioned earlier. And I think that, because for for me, with this student agency recognition, and if it's taken seriously, also comes the idea that is a strong belief, and I've been learning to believe more and more about this. What I'm going to say next is that young people have much more capabilities to do good things for themselves and for the others, and even lead the way forward than we give them credit for. And I think we need to move forward from the student voice. It's just, send students a questionnaire or ask them a question, what do you like about this, or what do you want to do next, is to help them. Again, going back to Michael, and Michael is talking a lot about the students as change agents. And his new book that's just it comes out in any day now, the sixth edition of the new meaning of educational change. The end of the book is actually it's almost like an epitaph to the evolution of the kids, what he calls the evolution of the kids, where we need to really think more about what the kids are capable of doing, and then give them more and more leadership in these things. Again, I hope that people don't misunderstand me, because I'm not saying that we just need to ask kids what do you want to do whatever you want to do. It's about education. It's educating. There are a lot of kids, Jim, and you know this better than I do, who believe that I don't have an agency. I can't do this.
Right.
I don't have the skills, but they do if we just create a kind of a conditions in the school, and that I think would be a great next thing to be included in this thinking.
This leads to one of my last questions here. Do you think that Finnish schools have a different understanding of what a school is than maybe other places? And if so, what's the purpose of a school?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jim, and this is one of those questions that people often ask, that how do I see the Finnish school different? I think if I mention just briefly three things without going too much into details, we can talk about those if you want to. But I think that the first thing is that whereas much of the rest of the world has moved, often led by the organization like the OECD and others, to think about school education as a duty, that it's something that you must do. And kids learn very quickly that education is that I have to do it. It's my duty to do education. Even parents may use the kind of a language that that school is your job. You have to do that. But in Finland, we have been very careful in making sure that everybody would understand that education is a right. It's a human right that everybody has, and that right cannot be taken away from you. But this right also comes with the responsibilities and it creates a very different school system when the kids go to school and they understand that this is my right and responsibility to learn. It's not the kind of a duty that I have to make myself to the lifelong learning. Then the second big difference is the what we call a whole child approach, or kind of a holistic approach to learning, which means that unlike many other countries where literacy and numeracy, certainly here in Australia, nowadays it's almost entirely about literacy and numeracy, what matters in the school. That the Finnish school has been traditionally, since the 1980s, when this idea was developed, based on the idea that the children have different intelligences and ideas, and they need to, in order to develop and grow good citizens and successful individuals, that they need to be helped to learn in a kind of a holistic way. And this is where the well-being and health become a very important thing. Again, here in Australia, children's health and education are completely separate things. But in Finland, we have been moving more and more to kind of a more holistic, integrated model, that you can't be a good learner if your well-being sucks, that you have to do those things. And school is a kind of a place to do that. And then the third and final thing here, Jim, I think, is the Finland's like a genuine commitment to what lifelong learning means. And again, this is a kind of a political mantra in many other countries, but Finns take it very seriously, that the education is not something that happens when you start your schooling and then you graduate. It's something that you continue to throughout your life. And the important outcome, if you think like this, then the important outcome of any level of education, school education in Finland, is to what extent the skills and attitudes and beliefs about learning and importance of learning have developed during the schooling. And so these are the things that often distinguish Finnish or Nordic systems from many others. And I think that the future as well from now on is built on these three central elements and beliefs and values.
Oh, I love it. And I would say I can't imagine a great life that isn't a learning life. Like, I think a life that doesn't involve continuous learning is impoverished to some extent.
Yeah, but often people, when you say learning, they learning equals to school
Yeah,
education.
no, no, no.
Some
It's
young
being
people
able
say,
to do more, see more,
yeah,
understand more, perceive more, it's that. Peter Senge says you're tapping into the generative process of life. You're a living, growing thing when you're a learning thing.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I've got a couple last questions. I'm so grateful for your time, and I hope we've got time for just two or three more. So, first question is one I'm sure you asked, but can this change happen at the classroom level, or at the school level, or at the district level, or does it have to happen at the state level? The kind of movement towards a school, and I realize a Finnish school is one thing, but a school even in the United States, a school in Louisiana might be different than a school in Minnesota. But having a school that's succeeding in the ways you're describing it, where does that change happen?
Yeah, I think, Jim, the short answer is that we need all these levels and all those systems that have the local or regional, local level, regional, and then the kind of a state level. All these three elements need to be there to create something that people, again, Michael talks about systemness, that how these different levels kind of operate. But I think we also, if we look at the research over the last 50 or 60 years about education systems, um, that those efforts where the system from the top tries to change what happens in a school, they almost all of them have failed.
Mm.
And OECD's own reviews about these kind of a state-led reforms indicate that 4 out of 5 policy that try to change things in a school fail or are never implemented. Often never implemented means that it never travels from the central office of the government to the classroom. And I think now it's time to really accept that the states, the central administration can never mandate what matters in the classroom. And that's why we need to look at all these three levels like you were asking. I think the key place is the local level and the capacity at the local level to change things and drive things. Those education systems that don't recognize that, they often take this capacity, they suck the capacity out of the schools and make kind of force them to think that the right answers and instructions will come from the top. And those things will continue to fail. That's not only my view, but it's a view of many others as well. So, and understanding the role of these three levels in a different ways, and that they need different things. Again, Michael calls about this top level, that what is a kind of a key thing that should be happening in the state level, is he's calling it intriguing the top, that the schools and the middle level should try figure out new things to do in a way that would intrigue the top, that ministers and authorities go, wow, this is an amazing idea, and then just support those good things. So I think they're all important, but in a different ways, just like you mentioned in your example as well. That's something we need to understand.
He's always thinking. That's like you. He's just continuously surprising with his brilliant ideas. So if I'm a principal in a school, this is our last question, but if I'm a principal in a school, what's my next step?
Depends where your school is. If it's in Finland, I can tell you right away. Just relax.
Let's say it's an American school.
That's I'm not sure what that would be in times like this, to be honest. I feel a lot of sympathy for any American educators in a situation where so many uncertainties are around. But I do know that the many American schools and school principals do amazing things, even in the circumstances that are not always, supporting what they do. Meaning, thinking about these heavy-handed policies in many states there, the growing socioeconomic inequalities that the particularly public schools are experiences, and shortages of teachers and stuff. But I would probably, if you allow me, Jim, I would go back to your previous question about these three important things. Like, if I was leading a school and assuming that these, what I'm going to say next or mention next, are not happening in my school, I would probably try to work on those things, because these are the things that any principal can do without asking too much permissions. And one of them is the make sure that the kids have enough frequent breaks where they can go outdoors, preferably outdoors, and play and hang around, spending time with themselves. I would probably also, as a principal, make sure that our homework policy is a decent, that the homework is high quality and purposeful, and any of the homework that doesn't make much sense would be deleted or reduced. And then the learning experiences in my school that the students have really support their holistic learning. So these are some of the things I probably would consider, and it may be completely inappropriate in some schools, but I think, but based on my experience previously, I would say that this might be, if I was a principal like you asked, I would probably think about these things.
Well, you're not going to come up with this is what every school should do exactly the way I describe it plan, I don't think. I don't think
No.
that's the way it's going to go. Anything you'd like to add that you think I've not given you a chance to say that's important? I've missed something important.
No,
Okay,
Jim, this
yeah.
has been an absolutely fabulous conversation, and I love the way you kind of step in and share your own views. And I think that's really what makes a thing like this, rather than being an interview, being a conversation and dialogue. I love it. But there's one thing that I was thinking as we went through these things that I think is becoming more and more important. And I know that this is happening and well understood in the United States, and it's a role and importance of building healthy relationships in school. And we do know from data, for example, the OECD's PISA data shows that the children who experience healthy student-teacher relationships in schools are much better learners. Full stop. So there's a strong correlation between those things. So I think that the importance and meaning of building healthy relationships in schools cannot be underestimated. And here's the thing, that one of the old American ideas, and the strength of the American education culture is that there's so many good ideas. Many of them are never implemented or employed in schools. Many of them, by the way, are employed in Finland and many other countries, but not in the US. But here's one thing that I've come across about 10 years ago, and this was already before the pandemic, but it has really been amplified after the pandemic. And it's a thing called teacher looping. And I'm sure that Jim, what I'm talking about. The teacher looping it's an old American idea that means that the same teacher is teaching and traveling with the same group of kids number of years, more than 1 year. And now the most American primary schools, for example, or high schools, just like here in Australia, are organized in a way that every year you have a new teacher. Like if you're year 4 teacher, then you have a new class next year. Or these kids who are with you this year, they will have a new teacher next year. And this is not the evidence-based way of building relationships. And this arrangement actually came before we were thinking about the role of relationships in a way that we do right now. So I think that I would encourage more primary schools and schools in general in the US and North America and here in Australia to think about how can we rearrange the kind of just the culture of school, the organization of teaching in the school, so that it would optimally support the building healthy relationships between kids and the adults with the teachers. And this looping is a powerful thing. It's expanding in the US as we speak. There are more and more schools coming into this realization that we need a different type of arrangement so that the kids can create these relationships with their teachers, and that the teachers can have these relationships with the kids and their parents as well, to make the schools better places. And I think that this would be my kind of a last wish and hope for educators to think about the importance of relationships now in the time when more and more young people really see the world around them going crazy, unsafe, unpredictable, unhealthy, and that's why these relationships are more important than ever before. And I know I've heard you speaking, Jim, a number of times, and you often talk about the same things, but I would love to leave this audience and listeners with this idea.
Love the idea. I think I couldn't agree more. I think it's very hard to learn in an environment you don't feel safe, and it's a lot easier to learn when you have someone who sees you and values you. And that's the same for your relationship with your peers and with your educator as well. So and also it's hard for uh, teachers to build great relationships with kids if they don't have great relationships with their colleagues. So there's a
That's
lot
right.
wrapped
That's
up
right.
in. I'm so grateful for your time. You've been so generous. You're like a world leader, and I get to sit down and talk with you. And the next thing is we have to figure out when we're going to see a hockey game together. So
Oh yes, yeah,
next
Canada.
time you're in Canada or the U.S., or I'd love to see one in Finland, but I haven't had a chance to go there yet. But that would be the place to go. So one of these
Yeah,
days
no,
I have to
hockey
make
is
it
big
happen.
there right now, so it's a place to go.
That's right. That's right. If not, there's always the AFL. I like that too. But I'm so grateful for your work, and man, you're such a force for good. I'm really I can't say thank you enough. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Jim.